Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are here to discuss another essay by Isaiah Berlin. This one is going to be Two Concepts of Liberty. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, Two Concepts of Liberty. You are on it.
Please, Daniel, would you like to begin the opening remarks on the essay?
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, always wonderful to speak with you. This is one of those essays that I think if really should almost be required reading if you're going to do any, well, basically for any citizen, like of any country, because it is so easy to use the word freedom and not have a concept of what it means. When Mr. Berlin so clearly shows, going through the history of Western thought, where the concept is meant in different ways. Positive liberty. Sometimes I've heard people talk about the positive liberty in the sense of, say, the government providing you with healthcare or the government providing you with roads or different things like that. I want to start off and specify that Isaiah Berlin is more interested in positive liberty, meaning self-determination. So the ability of you to have the capacity, say, to reason or to fix the pipes in your house, to do certain things. Where negative liberty is where you're left alone. You're not coerced. You're not put into any force. And so when you have negative liberty, it would be a situation where if I want to walk downstairs, there's no locked doors, for example. I can just walk down. There's no locked doors. Where positive liberty would be I have the capacity to walk downstairs. So I have the capacity to actually make it occur. Now, Mr. Berlin is not saying that it is always one or the other. You know, it's always a mixture of the two when you have civilization. The issue that he has seen that he really wants to focus on is this tendency in political thought to say something like the following, and this is the dangers of positive liberty. And since he's grown up, you know, he's seen the Soviet Union, totalitarianism, Nazism, fascism. This is what he's really concerned about. He's really concerned about any philosopher, which I think someone like Rousseau would fall under this category, that says you cannot be free unless you're rational. And since I don't think you're rational, I'm not restricting your freedom to force you to do X, Y, and Z. So, you know, because you're not rational, you're not free, therefore I'm not taking away your freedom to do something, because you don't have freedom unless you have rationality. And very often what occurs in thought is the notion of I'm taking away I am forcing you to gain freedom per se. You know, you're not rational, so I'm going to force you to be rational, and then you can be free. And since there's no pre-existing freedom in that positive schema, this is not a violation of freedom. Well, Isaiah Berlin is very concerned about that because who defines what is rational, according to what standard, and who gets to decide? And so that can make someone very, very powerful. Now, again, I really want to stress, Isaiah Berlin, he likes FDR. He is considered a classical liberal. He is not. I've heard this essay, and as we go further in the discussion, we can get into the complexities of it. I've heard in more libertarian circles, almost where to say that by positive freedom, Mr. Berlin is talking about like roads or healthcare or different things like that. Now, that will come up in the debate of freedom. Can the government, say, force you to pay for other people's healthcare? That is a facet of the discussion. But again, Isaiah Berlin is trying to find a kind of liberalism. We talked about last time, he's looking for conditionality versus relativism. And likewise, he believes in a robust government, but he also wants to not have the liberal side of freedom go in the direction unintentionally of a monism or a notion of forcing people to be free that unintentionally leads to totalitarianism. And then I'll pass it on to Dawood. So negative liberty is going to be dealing with the idea that there are no locked doors, you can just walk downstairs, where positive freedom is going to be more of your capacity to self-determine, to actually walk downstairs. So that's kind of a metaphoric way that I think about it sometimes.
Thank you. That was great opening. Maybe I will give my own paraphrasing of the two concepts of freedom, because what Berlin does in this essay is really interesting train of thought. He begins by introducing a dichotomy, and the dichotomy seems very clear and neat, and then he starts to make it messy and show the tension between these two. So negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom, we can say it is a bounded space in which you are left to do what you want, or do what you want, or be what you want, which you're capable of based on your capacities and your desires and your beliefs. And then the positive freedom is something, a process, a way of viewing our actions and volition that is striving to be aligned with certain principles and values. Positive freedom is an expression of our commitments, an expression of what we value, what we want to be. That's why it is attached to the self. It is self-determination. It's an outcome of what the self desires, what the self prefers. And so there are that's an extra boundary or extra set of factors that determine our actions. One line that jumps at me was by that quote by Auguste Comte, who says, "Why is it that we don't allow people to have a freedom of choice in chemistry and physics, but we allow them to have freedom of choice in moral philosophy?" That line is intending to suggest that there's some principles, there's something like logic, rationality, that if we are faithful to, our freedom is just an exercise of what is the right thing to do, what is the correct thing to do. And if that is seen from within, it becomes the process of a person exploring what is right, discovering what is right, and then enacting that. But sometimes it is not something that is explored and enacted and expressed from within. Sometimes it becomes about from outside, a perspective from outside that looks at the person and says, I'm going to decide what is good for you because I understand, I'm more rational than you. So I make some decisions, and that's a paternalistic turn of the positive liberty, which Berlin kind of warns against. Yeah, for now, that's good. For my turn, I should warn the listeners, I have a bit of a headache, and it might make me less articulate than usual, even more inarticulate. Please, John.
So going off of what you've said, I think one of the things that he wants to warn against as he muddles this distinction between the two, positive and negative liberty, is as the distinction is muddled, you start to see where humanity pops up. Because throughout the 19th century, most political philosophers have defined freedom. They put the emphasis that where the stress falls is usually on the positive, freedom, and the ability to be a rational actor. But towards the end of the essay, and this is where I think things start to get the most interesting, and where he makes some really, really, to be honest with you, he gives credit to people much earlier than him. I was, I don't know that this stuff existed in Vico, which he claims it does, in Machiavelli, which he also claims it does. But he starts saying that, positive and negative freedom, even if you want to say, like sometimes, dictators or despots want to do, like freedom, equality, they all fit under one umbrella, and they must not logically contradict one another. Even if you want to say that, that still doesn't account for human diversity. And he makes a reference to something, what we now call intersectionality, which is, we're not people who live on islands. We're not, Robinson Crusoe, this like single autonomous atom that reasons. We live in a community and we have interests. And he says, whether I'm an Englishman or I'm from China, or whether I'm, from a capitalist country or from a communist one, or from, if I'm a grandparent or a mother or whatever, it shapes my set of interests above and beyond what I might think liberty and freedom give me, which speaks to something much more human than our abstract concepts of freedom and liberty, which is the idea of recognition. And I think that's really the fundamental concept of the last third, maybe, of the essay, is that we want to be free, we want to be prosperous, we want to have liberty. Yes, that's great. The mistake that much of the Western philosophical tradition and political philosophy has made is to think that that's enough. And that they haven't made room for that very human set of needs and desires, like the need to be seen, the need to be felt or heard or understood or recognized. And he says, even if you do this in a democracy, in a liberal democracy, you're not necessarily guaranteed all of these things. But that is what we really have to balance, freedom and liberty, which may be conflicting at certain points in time for certain people and for certain societies, but balanced with recognition, which is increasingly important for us post, 17th century or so. He makes a note in there about the Renaissance and the Reformation. It seems to become very, very important right around that time. That's what I thought the most interesting part was. I was reading it and I was thinking, well, this isn't terribly impressive. And then I realized, well, when he was giving the lecture, it was 1959. I kind of weaned myself on the likes of Kwame Anthony Appiah and people who, like, this is where they start, right? Like cosmopolitanism and values pluralism, like Amartya Sen, the great economist and philosopher. Like values pluralism is kind of where he starts as a philosophical assumption. It works from there. But Amartya Sen, I don't think, was writing in 1959. That was the very, very, very beginning of his career. And it was interesting to hear someone like Berlin, sort of break from the major trend in a lot of political traditions and say that, maybe freedom and equality don't necessarily always go together. Maybe sometimes they work at cross purposes. And that still they have to be balanced with particularly unique human needs and wants and desires.
Oh, magnificent. Sometimes I think of this, the two concepts of liberty, or this distinction between different types of freedom. It's now so much kind of the water we swim in that it's kind of like Karl Popper's falsification. Like basically no one argues against falsification as the criteria by which for Popper define science from pseudoscience. Like no one argues that. And it's so common now that it's hard to remember that there was actually a time where that was a new idea, and it was a huge idea because it's so accepted.
And it was relatively not long ago.
No, that's what's crazy.
Is that within living memory for some people? Yes,
absolutely. Absolutely. And, I guess George Soros is sitting in the man's class. I mean, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
So, it's not like falsification is now part of the air you breathe, in the same way that like the concept of the black swan by Nassim Taleb or anti-fragile, there are these concepts that now when someone does a paper on anti-fragile, you're like, okay, I've read this a million times. Come on now, failing because it's so much part of the air. In the same way that when you get this distinction between positive and negative freedom, everyone uses it basically in different ways. Now, there are people that will say he needs to go a little further, and I will get into that in a minute. That's fine. But the whole framing, the other thing that's interesting, apparently this, and I'm not sure if this is true, and this is just crazy, like this was all done off the dome. This was not written. This was based on a lecture that then was transcribed afterwards. I always forget with Isaiah Berlin, I don't know if all of his essays are oratory.
I think most of the major ones, yeah.
What the heck? So he's just off the dome. And
he didn't like writing.
He didn't like writing. And he didn't even apparently do notes. He just walked around and gave us, how long is this?
A 60-page essay.
60 pages that he just presented off the dome. What? It's amazing. I just think it's amazing. I love this man. The other thing that is important, and I think you noted, apparently he was quite famous for also ascribing ideas to people, because he would say this person, like kind of almost as a gesture of honor, like he would not take credit for original ideas. If he had any grounds by which to see it in a previous thinker or to credit to them, he would do that. And I think there is a little bit of that going on. That should be noted. The other thing I was going to say, I think the two concepts of liberty, I'm so glad you brought up this element of social recognition, as I'll call it, because that he brings out the positive and negative distinction, tries to show the dangers, but then also suggests that you need to kind of have an opening for both, where neither of them can satisfy the role of a social recognition that needs to have a place. The problem is, in the same way that with the Hedgehog and the Fox, people take that initial distinction and then forget the whole tragedy of Tolstoy part. They'll also take the two concepts of liberty and forget the rest of it that's working toward a very intentional muddling. The reason you have to, why
does he always name the essays? Well, I mean, he may not have named the essays after the most boring parts of the actual material that is presented.
As we were talking, I was wondering as you were speaking, John, is it part of the nature of an oratory presentation where you start off with the main framework and kind of the easy dichotomy so then people can follow your argument? And I guess in speaking, I've always heard this, you start with that because then if they fall asleep, they at least got the mental model. But of course, the problem is that then they just get the mental model and they don't actually see what you're doing with that, because he intentionally muddles the concepts so that there has to be a human element. Because if they're muddled, then the philosophy doesn't do the work for you, right? You have to have the human element get involved to figure out where one go, how to, it's like cooking, how to bring the ingredients together. And the human element is important. And that social recognition, again, which I think is very important, is I think missed in this essay, because people just assume that he's saying that we need to focus on negative freedom. Yes, he is emphasizing the dangers of positive freedom in this essay because he's in the 20th century. But but he's not saying that therefore the name of the game is like, I guess, hard libertarianism or something like that, because there's a social recognition. Now the debate becomes, what is the nature of that social recognition? What is the role of the federal government, the local government, the state government, the community? Now we have the whole political debate, but it's very problematic that this essay can forget the whole element of human recognition that is there.
I was amazed. I looked up
Sure.
Just a quick thing, I promise.
Oh,
on Wikipedia, I think the Hedgehog and the Fox, maybe a 2-paragraph description. The name Tolstoy was not even mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is what the essay is about. I mean, the whole Hedgehog and the Fox thing are like 3 pages at the beginning of a 50-page essay.
Yes, it's
Not
critical. And it's happened to the 2 concepts of liberty. Isaiah Berlin is a victim of, he's a victim of this. It's a problem.
Yeah, recognition. I think bringing in recognition into the essay, into the argument about freedom, shows that it's possible to shift our paradigm, the paradigm or the lens through which we are looking at actions and decisions. And what recognition allows us to see, using the concept of recognition as opposed to freedom, is it brings to our view our relationality to each other, that we have this relationship, and our freedom, if it increases on my side and only on my side, there are things that might happen in the relationship that are sacrificed. I also wanted to see this interesting, the difference between looking at the essay from the beginning and looking at it from the end. So he does something at the end of the essay where he talks about the one and the many, talking about the values. And he talks about the possibility that some people entertain, some of us might entertain this, maybe it has a platonic flavor, that all good things, all values should ultimately be harmonious with each other. And if we pursue a value, it shouldn't compromise the other good things that we want, or the other good things that we are pursuing. So for example, if you are pursuing equality, that shouldn't necessarily, should not, if you're truly doing that, if you're genuinely pursuing increased in one of those values, it shouldn't compromise freedom, because they're both good things. They both are harmonious in the big picture. He does that in the beginning in a different way. In the beginning, he says that some people talk about equality and justice as things that might cancel out the very possibility of freedom. They say in this society, in these conditions, if we don't have sufficient equality, it doesn't even make sense to talk about freedom. So the person who cannot afford to do certain things because of financial constraints, then they're not free. So that the line was that captured this was, the freedom for an Oxford Don is not the same freedom as the person who's the laborer or worker or the peasant. But he says, no, freedom is freedom. It's different. It is a different kind of value. It is true that sometimes we have to sacrifice it to gain an increase in other things that we value, like equality and social justice. But to say that freedom is different, or we cannot talk about freedom if there is no equality, that is falling into a fallacy that he reveals at the end. So to me, it was a useful thing to do, that at the end he talks about the system of values as harmonious with each other. In the beginning, he talks about concepts and the incommensurability of the concepts freedom and the other concepts, other values like justice and equality.
I love how the theme of reason not being enough keeps popping up over and over and over and over again in our reading.
Mm-hmm.
How he starts out with these concepts that have been handed down over 300 or 400 years within a very well-defined tradition of freedom and liberty. And he comes to this point of, well, if that's all you have, it's clearly not enough. And then there's just, you have to muddle the neat piles of paper somehow. And somewhere in that muddled situation is actually your real solution. It's not this sort of Platonic fallacy of easy rational distinctions. Your answer is not there. The reason is not enough. The human element, if you want to call it irreason or whatever, it has to be figured in somehow.
Well, it's funny because rationality always has to be defined by a certain principle. And I think it was very, very good what Mr. Ghazi was talking about the principle. And how do you decide that that is the principle that rationality should be organized by, other than by non-rational means? Because the rationality has to come after the principle. But you see what ends up happening is when you convince yourself that all you need is rationality, you secretly smuggle in a principle and act like the rationality is the source of that principle. And then you force it on everyone and act like that they must ascribe to it because it is rational, as opposed to an expression of a non-rationality in a logic that follows from that non-rationality, but is different from rationality as a different kind. That doesn't mean it's wrong. No one is saying it's necessarily wrong, but it's different as an epistemological entity. And that's where Mr. Berlin is so good, because what he wants to, when he talks about harmony, it's kind of interesting because you have this danger of monism, which is there's a single kind of principle. And if everyone is rational, that will make them more free, that will make more equality, and so on and so forth, which is kind of interesting because that sounds like the harmony. But as I understood, the harmony can kind of have a different element because if you have the human recognition, because for example, let's have an orchestra, right? Like the piano's not always playing. The violin isn't always playing. There are certain times where you need to stress equality, certain times where you need the strings need to swell up and you talk about individual freedom. And then there are times where those back out and you have the soloist come forth that's talking about the need for economic equal opportunity, right? The movements and the emphases and the changes in the music actually all come together to create a harmony. But the only time to know when which note should come up and which one shouldn't be is the human element, the participation in the community and the knowing of the individual people. So if we make this distinction between harmony and monism, when he's talking about harmony, he's not like saying it in the monistic sense where if you do one thing, you know, if you emphasize freedom, that therefore you're also going to get justice and all these different things. It only makes sense. This is why it is kind of tragic, actually, that the human recognition element of this essay is left out, in my opinion, because that's the only way to see the distinction between harmony and monism, or at least for me, it makes it much clearer, because when you are relating to the human being, you can kind of tell what notes of the music need to come up and how that's going to harmonize. And you have to move between the values relative to the circumstance and to the individual. And that's why also, you know, the other thing I was going to say, and then I'll pass it on. Again, it's just interesting when you go back and you read an essay, how things you just kind of didn't get before, but now you get, and you're like, oh, that's kind of a big deal. Where he smuggles in right at the beginning, where he says, where ends are agreed, the only questions left are those of means, and these are not political but technical. I kind of, I read that, you know, I roll whatever the year I read this, I didn't think much of that, but that's actually that's massive what he's saying there.
That stood out to me too.
You know, it's like where he also, and then he goes, you know, because if you make that mistake, you must believe that all political and moral problems can thereby be turned into technological ones, you know, technical ones, right?
Lots of expertise.
You know, and so that's the autonomous rationality problem. And this also means that politics is inherently philosophical per se. It cannot avoid being philosophical if by that we're talking about values and determining values. And it has to be messy. It must be messy, and it must have a dialectical element. That is a massive point that he's making. And if you take that seriously and you buy that principle, well, then politics is different. Then politics is different on what you're doing in a political discussion, and it must have the human recognition element, because you're trying to figure out these messy values that sometimes you stress this one and you stress the other, and the only way to figure that out is in the human element. So politics won't work then without the individual, without the human recognition that John's talking about. Politics is doomed without the human recognition. And what does politics today tend to go toward? Not human recognition in any way whatsoever. And so, you know, that it would follow that political would be in such disarray if there's not going to be the recognition of the other. So that really stood out to me at the beginning.
Great. I'm really happy about this introduction of the human elements. Let me say something brief about this human domain, including human recognition. What we are talking about when we talk about the human element, the human domain, the genuinely and uniquely human, is a space, a domain where we don't say anything goes on the one hand, we don't say anything goes, it's just a random choice, arbitrary. On the one hand, on the other hand, we also don't say it's mathematics and it can be proven, it can be observed like the processes of physics and chemistry. It is something in between. And it includes issues of politics, questions of morality, and also art. So let's say you and I are, the three of us are standing in front of a painting, and one of us really likes the painting. The other two are not convinced. The other two are just aesthetically, it doesn't resonate with us. But while we have these different tastes, we can listen to each other and recognize the reasoning for why one person might like this painting, what one person might find in this painting. And again, that the person who likes the painting, or we can transfer the whole topic to a person who really feels convinced about a moral decision, a way to resolve an ethical dilemma. We can listen to each other's reasoning, the way we confront the same situation, and we disagree. And that disagreement is not going to be reduced to a problem in physics or chemistry. And it's not going to be waved at as a totally anything goes kind of situation of, we all have our tastes. So it's a difference of feelings, and so it's random. And that recognition it allows us to reject both the negative freedom in its pure and absolute form and the positive freedom in its pure and absolute form, which would be a tyrannical way of saying this should be your taste, and anybody who doesn't agree with this is not educated enough. And on the other hand, the absolute negative freedom, where we say, it's just a matter of taste. Anybody's entitled to their opinion. So that human domain is where we are doing something that is not falling on either side. Yeah.
I wanted to, if anyone has made it this far in the video and wants a superb recommendation, not my, but a recommendation for a superb book on exactly the kind of thing that Berlin is talking about from another angle. Popper has already come up in this conversation, and you probably know what it is if it's Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. I don't know if you've read it, but this is all about how the idea of social engineering through having one umbrella idea, take Plato, take Marx, through the proletarian revolution or whatever your idea is, if all of your political decisions are driven towards the ultimate aim of achieving that idea ends up killing millions of people. And he wrote this, in the 40s, which was an awfully interesting time to write it. But I thought it was it's actually my version at least is 2 volumes. It's quite a long thing, but I mean it's brilliantly argued, and is despite the fact of Karl Popper having this tradition of being this Vienna Circle, logical, mathematical. This is like one of the greatest pieces of political philosophy I think I've ever read, and he talks about the same that same thing, that unity. What in the Stanford Encyclopedia is called the Ionian Fallacy. Sometimes it's the Platonic ideal, making the mistake of thinking that everything that a society wants to achieve can necessarily not ever be at a logical, that they always have to agree with one another, that freedom and prosperity and liberty will always necessarily mutually enhance one another. Sometimes it's a zero-sum game, and sometimes it's a mutually additive game. But it's a great book if anyone is interested in sort of another tack on why social engineering of the sorts that can come out of these thinkers is dangerous.
No, that's an outstanding tech. Break that Open Society. I think it's Marcise Olson's The Breakdown of Nations. I also think Jonathan Rout's Kindly Inquisitors, Government's End. These are also thinkers who are not easily put in a political camp, because they are thinking much more holistically and on all different sides in very profound texts. And I miss thinkers like that. they're hard to find. No, you're absolutely right, John. His Karl Popper's work on historicism is also, I think, really, really important. To what Davoud is saying, for me, I think about it. I guess the language that I always talk is conditionality. So you have fundamentalism, relativism, and conditionality, which is the notion that you have to know the conditions and be in the conditions to understand why they unfold as they do. So, for example, like recognizing a person is to say that if you lived your life X way, you would probably think Y way too. Like if you met the conditions of that person, your thinking would go this way. You don't meet those conditions because you didn't grow up on that farm and choose to do this thing in high school and choose to read these books. So you don't meet those conditions, but there is a reason. This is the key. The key for conditionality is you're saying that there's a reason. This person has reason for being the way that they are. And then that means there's something to learn from them. But that would require empathy. That would require the relationship. And I think conditionality for me helps kind of find this middle ground because there, like you say, it's not anything goes. There are conditions and there are certain even necessary things that follow from those conditions. But they do make space for the human element. And the human element, I think, is very important. Another, as Isaiah Berlin goes on and he starts to muddle things, one of the ways I think about like the way he muddles it, if I take the phrase, the freedom of the individual. So you take the phrase freedom of the individual and you go, oh, okay, freedom of the individual. They're left alone. There's no restraint, freedom of the individual. Well, the word of is quite funny because freedom of the individual could mean the freedom the individual created. Right? So they created this freedom and they did something by a certain capacity. So it's interesting in the phrase freedom of the individual, there's actually a double action that's going on because whenever you're talking about the freedom of the individual, you're talking about a double action, which then in order to figure out like which of those possible sides of the Schrodinger's cat per se, it's alive or dead, is it, the freedom of as in from restraint or is the freedom as created by the individual, you'd have to be in the experience and presence of the individual. And that would require the human recognition. Another phrase that I think captures the ambiguity is if I said, if I showed you a painting and I said, I made it by myself. I made it by myself. Well, by myself could mean like without any help, or it could mean alone in a room, by myself. There was no one stopping me from making the painting. And actually, in order to make the painting, one would assume that I couldn't have someone punching me in the face or poking me or not providing me with food so that I don't starve and actually am able to you would assume that there would have to be a certain element of being left alone. But if all you are is left alone, then that's not going to create the painting. There also has to be the individual's capacity to generate the painting. They meet certain conditions to make it happen. But critically, the key idea there is that you can't separate positive and negative freedom so easily. Because you're always going to be having them operate in concert. And if they're always operating in concert, then to figure out how they operate in concert, you have to be there. To see if the girl was alone in the room, you'd have to go in the room and see if there was anyone in there. You'd have to, maybe once he says, I made this painting by myself, she was alone in the room, or maybe there were people around her, but no one was bothering her. The point is, you would have to actually experience the girl to know what the phrase means. You'd have to meet the condition of knowing her to unpack how that particular freedom was expressed. And then the last thing I'll say that is critical and why ultimately we have to think in terms of community. If I was the world's greatest surgeon, let's say I'm the world's greatest heart surgeon on planet Earth, I have all the capacity in the world, and no one has ever or will ever stop me from carrying out that surgery. So I've got pure negative freedom. I've got pure positive freedom. Okay. Can I do a surgery on myself? No. If I were to fall over and have a heart attack, I can't do anything about it. No one would stop me from doing the surgery on myself. I have the ability to do the surgery on myself, but I literally could not do the surgery on myself, right? I would need the other. So there are certain situations, and we can get into more because actually this problem of this situation where you see the bothness in the need for the other can come out in a lot of different areas. But in this thought experiment, you see where the other, that we're negative and positive freedom in that situation, the individual has both, and yet that will not fix their problem. They will need the other. And that's where then you introduce the social element in the relationships. And then how do you organize all those different things?
What you just pointed to me is connected to human finitude in general. Yes. Like the surgeon cannot perform the surgery 100 years from now or 200 years from now or in the past to time travel. So this, one of the things that I really liked about this essay was Berlin throughout in the whole 60 pages, he refused to settle into a comfortable position. and take side with either of these two concepts, of liberty. Say, okay, maybe this one is a little bit better, maybe this one is more essential, or maybe in our time we need to pay attention to this one more. He really showed dialectical thinking, and that the human finitude, the human limitation that requires constant relationship and back and forth between both of these concepts. Yeah, we need some spaces to experiment, to have leisure, to have possibility, and also we need to check the reasons and rationale for the things that we do with that space. That's I think those are my final words for the essay. I would recommend it. It's a little bit long, but it's impressive knowing that, as you both said, it was a lecture and then transcribed later on, and then published as in the collection four essays on freedom or on liberty. That's good for me. John?
I'm good too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank y'all. No, I
suggesting the essay.
It's I just find it's amazing that it's like, I'm glad Karl Popper came up because it's like, for me, it's like falsification. It's the waters you're swimming in without even realizing it. But as I hope everyone listening to this conversation will glean, Isaiah Berlin, you have to go beyond the initial dichotomy or the initial framing to really get to kind of the bigger pictures that Mr. Berlin
read past the title line.
Yes. Oh yeah.
One last quick word about the life of these thinkers. So I don't know much about Berlin's life, but I know that Karl Popper, at the time that he was living, he had a relationship with the mainstream at the time, was logical positivism, but he really decided to go against them, and he became a very unpopular person during a majority of his own time, his own career. So one of the things that is consistent we should think about is going against the mainstream or being unpopular, and needing, in the context of thinkers and ideas, we always need people who think differently, who open up the possibility of the many, pointing to the different values that maybe we are neglecting. So
well, it's interesting that you say that, because when he gave this lecture in the late 1950s, the nature of Anglophone philosophy was still largely influenced by people like A.J. Ayer and logical positivism and things like that. And this reintroduced and revitalized the idea in English-speaking philosophy that you could use categories in intelligent ways to think about things that you couldn't necessarily boil down to logical or mathematical abstractions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And because of that, you see a complete rebirth of fascinating political philosophy by people like Nozick in the 60s and 70s, and this, to some extent, may have been responsible for it.
Yeah, great. The volume by Berlin that I have there is titled "Against the Current," which is beautiful. Yeah, beautiful, inspiring. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
And looking forward to next time.